It's not really news. The country's been getting fatter for decades, in spite of the fact that every day doctors are telling men, women, and children you need to lose some weight. Your health is in jeopardy. But even with all the statistics, research, and doctors' marching orders, the obesity epidemic is still just that, an epidemic. What has created this public health crisis, and what are the breakthroughs around this important issue? It's all up next on Vocal Point. Welcome to Vocal Point. I'm your host, Anqoinette Crosby. And on today's show, we'll discuss obesity and the factors that contribute to its spread, like cultural biases around food, lifestyle issues, and discrimination around marketing and food access. I'll introduce our panel in just a moment, but first, here's an overview.
There are many ingredients that contribute to the obesity epidemic currently plaguing the country. This public health problem is wreaking havoc on medical costs, reducing life expectancy, and provoking stigma and discrimination. Its causes are multifaceted, ranging from environmental, social, and economic to genetic and behavioral. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Journal of American Medicine, more than 1/3 of U.S. adults are obese. Non-Hispanic blacks have the highest rates of obesity, followed by Hispanics, non-Hispanic whites, and non-Hispanic Asians. In 2013, the District of Columbia and 7 states, including Maryland and Virginia, had a prevalence of obesity between 20 and 25%. Breaking this epidemic down along racial lines, Black and Latino populations are the hardest hit, and the reasons for this phenomenon are also complicated and varied. Life in the food desert. Families in predominantly minority and low-income neighborhoods have limited access to supermarkets and fresh produce. A study of a select group of Black communities uncovered that only 8% of African American residents lived in areas with 1 or more supermarkets. A similar problem exists in Latino neighborhoods, where people are often serviced by bodegas, small corner stores, and fast food restaurants. Junk food overload. Minority children are exposed to twice as many fast food enticements on billboards and other outdoor advertisements as other children, where companies excessively market low nutritional foods and sugary beverages. These junk food promotions are about 13% denser in minority neighborhoods than white ones. Playing it safe. Where? Studies show that children with limited access to parks, playgrounds, pools, and other green space have a 20 to 45% greater risk of becoming overweight. In some neighborhoods, African American parents will limit their children's daily outdoor playtime for safety reasons, especially their daughters. Latino children are less likely to be involved in after-school activities due to factors like cost participation, transportation, and language barriers. Eat this, not that. Minority communities are often unclear about which food options are healthy versus unhealthy. Health advocates recommend that schools and the medical community should be more aggressive about educating people on what to eat and why to eat it, but do so in a way that is culturally and linguistically sensitive. Obesity is far from a cosmetic concern. It can increase your risk of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, even certain types of cancer. These are some of the leading causes of preventable death. The good news is that even a modest weight loss can improve or even prevent some of the health problems associated with this complex disorder.
Joining me for today's discussion, Dr. Yolandra Hancock is a pediatrician with a special interest in childhood obesity. Dr. Kevin Washington is the president-elect of the American Association of Black Psychologists and also teaches here at Howard University in the Department of Psychology. And Dr. Tiffany Powell-Wiley does clinical research at NIH with a focus on obesity and heart disease. Also with us today, Jerry Mitchell. She's a motivational speaker and has lost over 150 pounds and kept it off. We'll hear her story in a moment. Seated next to her is Sonia Greer. Dr. Greer is a professor at American University and has done extensive research on how food is marketed to minorities. Welcome to all of you. So let's start off, Dr. Powell-Wiley, with talking about why is there an obesity issue, especially in the African American and Latino communities, but let's also talk about white communities as well. And what has the difference been in the last 40 years? Why are we seeing an increase?
First of all, I want to say thank you for having me here.
Thank you for being here.
I want to start off by saying we know, as the introduction said, that 1 in 3 individuals in the United States are obese. And it's not, again, just a cosmetic issue. It really affects health. Me as a cardiologist, I worry about my patients who are obese developing heart disease, having heart attacks, because that increases their risk. But we also know it increases your risk of diabetes and cancer as well. What we do know is that this trend in the increase in obesity has affected everyone in the United States, but primarily it has affected African Americans and Latino populations, with almost 50% of those populations being considered obese. And so what we think is that not only are there differences in how we've had been affected by genetics and those types of things, biologic factors, but we've also had differences in our environments, in our neighborhood environments, and how we have access to healthy foods, how we have access to areas for physical activity, and how that affects our ability to live a healthy lifestyle.
Dr. Washington, you've done some research on food deserts. Explain that a little bit about your research in East Oakland and the stresses that you say that African Americans may experience more than other groups.
Well, when we look at the idea of food deserts, we know that certain communities do not seem to have the resources, vegetables, fruits, as other communities. And so East Oakland, West Oakland, and in Oakland Hills, we noticed that there was the life expectancy of diverse populations, blacks and Hispanics, seemed to be lower in all of the particular affluent and the less affluent communities. And so once again, the food desert was a part of the process about how do I replenish my body. And so there's a systematic process that seems to be in place throughout the entire country with food deserts. And so racism plays an important role in that because, of course, food deserts are part of the racist process, but also because when one deals with the stressors, the psychosocial stresses of racism, it increases the allostatic load, which then increases the desire for sugars and carbohydrates. And so with that, going into your issue of cardiology, is that the body begins to crave the sugars quickly, the brain is satisfied, but over a period of time, the one becomes less likely to engage in active activities because of this idea of becoming fatigued and tired. And so there's less likely to opportunity to engage in physical activities. And then there is the issue of dysregulation of glucose metabolism, and then that increases the fat stores, and therefore you end up with racism, stress, and obesity.
You know, you mentioned that there's racism in the part of some of these healthier supermarkets not being in minority communities. Why are you saying that's racist?
Well, at some level, we know that certain food companies do not place themselves in certain communities that do not have a certain economic level. So if your earnings are not at, for one company at $100,000, $150 plus a year, they do not consider themselves to build the healthy foods, the grocery stores in those areas. And so as a result, then populations do not have access to fruits and vegetables. So we researched this in East Oakland, West Oakland. We found out that it was very unlikely for children in certain communities to have access to bananas that were not as brown, unbruised fruit and so forth and so on. But they were more likely to have access to honey buns and and jungle juice, which was intriguing.
Okay, Dr. Hancock, you are a pediatrician, and let's bring it back here to D.C. What are some of the things that you're seeing with children in certain areas of D.C.? What's happening there?
So we're seeing disease processes in children that we have historically not observed. My youngest diabetic patient was diagnosed at the age of 5, and he, at the age of 5, weighed 120 pounds. And he weighed more than I did, and he's 5 years old. And he comes from a history of parents with diabetes, grandparents with diabetes, and it goes to what you mentioned. East of the river, when I first started practicing in Ward 8, there was one grocery store, and it required 2 bus rides for this particular family to access the store. And even when accessing the store, the options were not there. If you went to the fruit department, it was subpar at best. And so when I try to encourage a family to seek out the healthier choice, you have to go where people are. So instead of expecting a higher end market to come in, I think that's where initiatives come in with corner markets and that sort of thing to make the food available so that you're not seeing hypertension in 10-year-olds. I have patients who are on high cholesterol medications at this point. I didn't think these were issues I'd have to manage. I was not necessarily trained in medical school to manage hypertension and hypercholesterolemia. I give that over to my colleague because I assumed that in pediatrics I would never have to see these disease processes, but I'm seeing them on a daily basis.
That's frightening. Dr. Greer, we're going to bring you in here because you study marketing and how marketers are actually targeting minority communities when it comes to food or soft drinks. And frightening, it's also being targeted to young children. Explain that a little bit.
Well, the whole notion of marketing is to provide people with something that they value. And so companies look for groups that they can identify and that they can specifically reach through some type of media and that they can talk to in a way that speaks to them. The issue with marketing has a couple of challenges in the African American community. One, African Americans tend to be more responsive to marketing. So we always want the latest, greatest thing. We're looking for variety in foods, and so we'll try the different types of foods that are put out there towards us. On the other side, marketers have to target us. African American and Latino families are the fastest growing, tend to be younger, and tend to have larger families. So from a profitability perspective, these are the markets that companies really have to reach. So in an increasingly competitive market, you want to target the groups that are growing.
So you were talking to me earlier about kids being targeted through social media. Now that's the next step. And how is that being done? And the fact that minority kids are online longer than, you say, white kids maybe.
Yes, we tend to use all forms of marketing. In fact, all media. We're, depending on the survey, anywhere from 5 to 8 more hours a week African American and Latino kids spend with media. So any type of effect of marketing is going to be intensified based on that. So marketers are targeting us. They're speaking to African Americans and Latinos in a way that makes people more excited about the products. This is being done through social media, increasingly through mobile technology. So mobile phones are used more by African Americans and Latinos. You think about something like location targeting. You target someone with a coupon for a fast food restaurant who walks by a fast food restaurant because that's what's in the food deserts. They actually call some of them now food swamps because there's food, but it's just the wrong kind of food that's there.
So what are communities to do?
Well, there's a couple of things I think. One is shows like this really help in getting the word out there and educating people about what some of these issues are. I think marketing is often underrated, but it's not something that you can say, hey, it's necessarily a social justice issue, because we've tried that. I work with the African American Obesity Collaborative Research Network, and people see it as a social justice issue sometimes. People also see it as, this is the way you have to make money. This is what companies do. The marketers are sometimes us. You know, we're talking about creating jobs in communities, so it's a double-edged sword. There is counter-marketing that can be done by making people aware of how they are affected and influenced by marketing, and that's something that we're working on as well.
Okay, so you're working with churches, and how so?
So we are looking at ways to counteract the obesity epidemic, particularly in the African American community. So we've partnered with at least 5 churches in wards 5, 7, and 8. Specifically, we're working with Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ, Plymouth, Pilgrim Rest Baptist Church, First Baptist Church, and St. John CME Church. And all of these churches are a part of a project really looking at new tools that we can use to encourage physical activity and improve diet. So we're actually looking at how people utilize things like wrist-worn physical activity monitors, how we can help them utilize those tools to understand the level of physical activity that they're getting, and how we might be able to develop a program to help them encourage physical activity in the future.
Are churches really responding, or is there any resistance whatsoever? Because a lot of times churches have a fish fry or, you know, a chicken dinner or something like that. And so is there any pushback at all?
Well, I think the thing about the church that's so important that we recognize is that it's really a source of social support, particularly in the African American community, that particularly the leader of the church, the pastor, or the minister within the church is really looked at as somebody who can help people understand what changes they need to make in their lives, and that includes changes around lifestyle. And so I think once we've engaged ministers in how important it is to change health, we've really had a great deal of success in engaging them in promoting physical activity and dietary change.
And along those lines, I was actually I spoke at a conference, American Clergy Leadership Conference, and the topic that I spoke on was actually the biopsycho spiritual aspect of human function. So we highlighted this idea of, if your body is a sacred temple, how do you teach your congregation to see it as the temple, and also the issue of be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? So the idea of how does your mind actually influence how you eat and how your body functions. So the clergy was very responsive, and they came from all over the country, as a matter of fact, to talk about this idea of the biopsychosocial aspect of human functioning.
And I really think that clergy are really on the front lines, just as physicians are, because they're seeing people who are dying prematurely from heart disease. They're seeing children who are getting sick because of obesity, and so they know that it's a huge issue, particularly in the African American community.
You know, I started off the program by saying it is an epidemic throughout the country. So we want to talk about other groups as well. You know, what about white communities? What's being done to address this?
I think there's been a sort of universal push for healthy living as a lifestyle as opposed to an intervention. And I think that's the key to the obesity epidemic. When you start classifying obesity as a medical condition, it has its pros and its cons. The pro is that it provides more resources. The con is that it puts a lot of responsibility on a clinician to make it a medical problem where a patient comes in for some sort of treatment. And it's a community problem. It's, as we mentioned, it's where you live, it's where you pray, it's where you learn, it's where you play. It's all of those things. And so when we think about it in that context, we think about it universally and how it affects everyone. And when you look at statistics, you actually see that within white populations, the obesity rates have actually plateaued and are starting to decline. When you look at particular populations such as African American females, particularly adolescent females, it's at a steady increase. And so although it's an important topic for everyone to address and to think about it in the context of a healthy lifestyle in general, I think it's this huge disparity that exists between African Americans and Latinos compared to Asians and Caucasians. It stands out that more attention needs to be paid to those particular populations, but certainly for everyone to take into consideration that eating healthier, that recognizing the importance of mental health and being physically active is important for everyone.
You know, we're talking about low-income communities, but the research is showing income matters, but it's not the only reason. Is that right? I mean, historically, African Americans seem to have this issue worse than others. And you mentioned young black girls. Why are we seeing an increase?
We're seeing an increase for a couple of reasons. One, statistics have shown that when young ladies go through puberty, it's assumed that they're going to gain a little bit of weight. It's sort of what we call an estrogen distribution of weight as a part of becoming a young lady. But from a cultural standpoint, when we like our curves, we like our thickness. When I counsel a young lady on the importance of maintaining a steady amount of weight gain, a normal amount of weight gain, I'm questioned in clinic. I've been told I need to eat a sandwich when I start talking to some of my patients about maintaining their rate of weight gain. So from a cultural standpoint, I think that there are issues at play that disallow us from engaging in healthful practices. I think it's role modeling. So if your mother eats a certain way, if your grandmother ate a certain way and they felt comfortable with their bodies despite the complications from being overweight or obese, it's hard for me as a clinician to convince you to change your behaviors when historically your parents, your grandparents, and everyone in your community is doing things contrary to what your clinician is recommending.
And Jerry, you can relate, can't you? Because you said, hey, your family loves to have a good meal.
Yes, very much so. I grew up in a household, we were allowed to eat whatever, and I grew up in a suburban neighborhood. I had a 2-parent loving household, and we did, buy fruits and vegetables and all those things, but I was allowed to eat whatever I wanted, and we also called in the carryout a lot and ate a lot of those foods. So that was very common in my household, to be able to just eat whatever I wanted, even though, we had fruits and vegetables and lean meats and all those things, but we constantly, and I was allowed to go to 7-Eleven and eat and go get whatever I wanted. It was never like, you shouldn't be having that or anything, even though my weight was going up, 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 up. No one really, they were like, well, I wish you would lose weight, but they wouldn't try to give me anything to lose weight.
So you said your family didn't tell you to stop, but your family has suffered from heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes.
Yes. I am probably one of the only people, if not the only adult in my family, and I mean my large family, that doesn't have some type of high blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, heart issues. My family have suffered, they've suffered greatly from obesity, and some of them are not even overweight. It's not just, it's not just about being overweight. The food that we eat can not just affect your body as far as getting big. Some of my family are not overweight, and they still have these illnesses that we're talking about today.
Let's talk, you look great. Let's talk about your weight loss journey.
Yes, I have been obese my entire adult life, and I was overweight kid, and I started to be obese in high school. And I've tried several diets. I tried to lose weight several times, but I just wasn't able to do it. So a lot of what you all are starting to talk about were certain ingredients I found out later that I had to restrict because I was actually addicted to them. I can't put sugar or flour in my body because I'm not able to control my consumption. And so it causes me to continue to eat. So I have, just like, there are people who are on other drugs or alcohol, and they decided they cannot no longer have it because they can't control it. Same thing for me. I cannot control it, and so I just don't put them in my body. But I do eat only single ingredient items such as chicken, carrots, lettuce. I don't, stuff. If I can't read it, I'm not putting it in my body.
So even with the lap band surgery and everything, the only thing for you is just cutting out certain foods in your diet. And do you agree with that, Dr. Powell-Wiley?
I definitely think it is about a lifestyle change. It really isn't, there's no quick fix to losing weight. So it's really about changing your diet, but also getting the physical activity that you need. And so that's where it really becomes important to think about ways to help people get that physical activity, particularly in areas where it may not be so accessible.
And okay, talking about physical activity, African American women,
right?
What have you seen? What has been the reason why a lot of African American women don't work out?
I mean, it's something we don't always talk about, that we don't like to talk about, but just anecdotally, we think about hair, and many black women think about hair. For one, I was a swimmer when I was a kid, and I stopped swimming because of my hair. But there's data, there are papers that show that African American women are less likely to report physical activity specifically because of their hair and their attempts to maintain a certain hairstyle. And so it's not a conversation that we always have with our patients, but it's something to think about.
And they also have to take into consideration from a cultural standpoint how we've prioritized physical activity. A lot of African American women, and African Americans in general, think of physical activity as a way to lose weight, but not necessarily just to maintain good health. And I remember, I moved from Louisiana to California. In Louisiana, everything is fried and no one works out. I moved from there to Southern California, where everyone eats granola and everyone works out. And I'm thankful that I did it, because it certainly changed how much I appreciated being physically active just as a way of life. For me, I tell my patients it's like brushing your teeth. It's something you should do every single day, if not more than that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to take a break in the discussion and to show you a brief clip from a food forum that took place over the summer. It was put on by the Institute of Medicine. The lecturer is Dr. Nicole Avina. She shared some of her research on food addiction. We'll talk more about this subject matter after the video.
Could some people maybe be addicted to eating highly palatable foods that are rich in added sugars and sweets in a way that could resemble a drug addiction? And could this in some way contribute to the obesity epidemic? There are multiple reasons why people eat. The primary reason we think people eat is for hunger, but hunger is associated with negative reinforcement. It's taking away something that's bad. Whereas many people consume foods and talk about eating for hedonic purposes, or eating not because they're hungry, but because they derive pleasure out of eating the food or tasting the food. So when I talk about food addiction and when we're talking about some of the data that I'm going to go through today, we're talking about these hedonically driven types of foods. These foods that contain ultra-processed ingredients, lots of added things like sugars and fats, not the bag of baby carrots and not broccoli. We're talking about foods that can be hyperpalatable, and so these are foods that are stimulating multiple systems in the brain that are activating these brain reward systems in a way that could potentially be putting them into overdrive. If we look at the amount of sugar that people are consuming, we see that the average American is consuming 22 added teaspoons of sugar a day, and so that's much more than the World Health recommendation now states. And sugar seems to be one of the ingredients that people find to be particularly problematic. When they're trying to cut back on their intake, they find that it's very difficult to regulate their intake of foods that are rich in added sugars and carbohydrates.
So what about this idea of food addiction? You know, Dr. Washington, what have you seen?
You know, addictions can occur on multiple levels. We can be addicted to things that are legal or some things that are illegal. And so we learned very early on as children that we can satisfy our emotions through food consumption. When a baby cries, a baby gets a bottle or food. So that's something that becomes a part of the process of calming nerves and to calm the stomach and then to feel better. Well, over a period of time, that becomes associated with, of course, eating sugars and feeling better. And then the body becomes accustomed to this particular thing. So the sugar is one of those key elements, but not everyone has that same addiction to sugars. It could be salt, it could be some other things, but the body finds comfort through the consumption of that which seems to be most satisfying.
So that's emotional eating. And Jerry, did you experience that too, that addiction to food, obviously, and sugar especially?
Yes, I totally agree. I am very much addicted to sugar and flour, but I also, food period, like I have to make sure that I only eat a certain amount because I could binge on carrots if you let me. There's no limit because there is a need to comfort myself. And so I like what you were talking earlier about the spiritual component, I've had to lean on a more spiritual element instead of leaning on the food for a long, long time. You know, even though I grew up, you know, in a church and I prayed and I considered myself a devout Christian, I still was going to food before I was even going to my God.
So what was the turning point? I mean, you said you've tried everything under the sun. What was it? When was that day that it just hit you like, okay, this is my aha moment?
Well, you know, it was a process. It was me because I worked with people who were addicted to different other drugs, and I saw myself in them. I had the same exact, and I'm not like partly, I had the same exact symptoms they did. And then I got this, and I knew I was addicted to sugar. Flour, I didn't realize until later, but I realized that sugar and flour pretty much do the same thing in my blood system for me. So I react the same with flour products. So I got the knowledge to remove those things from my diet. And what really made me understand that I was addicted was when I removed it and I saw how I detoxed. Again, similar symptoms of a heroin addict. The way I dizzy, couldn't drive, moody, screaming at everybody. I mean, just really, really, physically ill while I was coming off the sugar and flour. Felt great afterwards, but.
How long did that take?
It took for me, because I was very obese and I was I was consuming sugar and flour products at a large rate every day. It took me about a month to really get this stuff out of my system.
You know, Dr. Hancock, what can parents do if they have their young children and, you know, they take them to McDonald's or they're giving them, you know, sugary cereals, what should they be doing at a very young age with their kids?
They shouldn't. No, I'm kidding. So I tell folks all the time, it starts preconceptually. When an adolescent young lady is maturing into womanhood, having those healthy behaviors present then, even before she, hopefully by the time she's married and has children, before she's even thinking about becoming a mother, so that her body is where it should be when she does conceive, because we know that there are neurochemical changes that happen in the body even before conception starts, so that the ovaries from which this new baby develops have been in this milieu of high sugar, high cholesterol, high inflammation. So that baby's already at high risk even before he takes his first sip of milk. Then encouraging young ladies to breastfeed once they do have babies, because it has been shown to be protective. And then taking that little one and being able to role model excellent behavior so that that child learns that healthful practices are a lifestyle, and it will continue from generation to generation as long as we can incorporate it at the start. And I tell parents it's never too late to start. If they're 1 or if they're 21, really role modeling. And there's a basic phrase that I use in clinic, 5210. 5 fruits and vegetables every single day, 2 hours or less of screen time, 1 hour of physical activity, and 0 to very little sugar-sweetened beverage. I tell them to take one of those and use baby steps towards achieving that goal. So if your child eats 5 vegetables a month, set a goal to do it 5 times a week. And then slowly but surely, you will go into the habits that will allow your child to reach their full potential.
So how much of this is really genetics?
Well, part of this deals with the epigenetic inheritance piece, right? So we know that there are certain things that we do inherit genetically, and my daughter, a 16-year-old daughter, is doing some research on obesity in African Americans in Florida, which was a very intriguing piece that I began to look at how can genes actually influence, of course, the weight gain process. Well, what I also know is that we can inherit our genetic, how our genes express themselves through from our parents. So this happens very early on. So what happens to a population that has encountered a plethora of challenges that have altered the way their genes express themselves, that desires to seek comfort through foods? And so we find out that the population seem to have this desire to consume, to nurture themselves, but it did not occur in the context of the environment immediately, but it occurred genetically, because as Dr. Cox says, that whatever female child, when she's born, she has all the eggs that she'll ever carry, which means then that biologically then she's given birth to her grandchildren. So by extension, she's not only influencing her life, but influencing the life of her own grandchildren just by what she does in the here and now. So the idea of epigenetic inheritance is very serious about around health. Weight.
And we're getting more and more knowledge about how obesity is so connected to the brain that, you know, because of the hormones that are released by fat cells, and many of the hormones that are released by fat cells are similar to hormones released in the brain, and that interaction between the brain and the weight has an effect on how you eat and what you eat and what you crave. And so there are many different questions about why some people are more addicted to sugar or salts or flour than others, and so those are definitely research areas currently.
A lot of our girls especially are being bombarded with pictures of certain celebrities, and so, you know, to look a certain way. So how much does body image play into this?
I think it plays a very big role. We've looked primarily at adults and how individuals perceive their body image in relation to pictures of what would be considered normal weight versus overweight or obese. And so we've seen that there is definitely at least about 10% of African Americans, but also about 10% of Hispanics who perceive that they don't necessarily need to lose weight even when they're obese. And that suggests that they don't necessarily perceive that there's a problem with the weight. And that also connects to the fact that they also perceive that that weight doesn't relate to a problem or risk for heart disease or risk for high blood pressure.
Right. So curvy is more acceptable maybe in African American and Latino communities. Is that right?
That's what we.
So why don't we talk about what is the difference between being obese and being overweight?
So one of the measures that we use to look at weight status is the body mass index, and that a cutoff of 30 at this point is considered obese throughout the population. And so that really takes into account your weight in relation to your height. And so it is a measure that there is some controversy as far as how it's utilized or how it relates to risk, particularly heart disease risk in different populations. But we know that when your body mass index is in the higher ranges, particularly 35 to 40, that's when, regardless of your weight, you really are at higher risk for disease.
And there are some problems with it. I was thinking about this because I went in for a health checkup 2 years ago, and they said that you know that you're borderline obese. It's like, really? Check this out. So so it's really one of those dynamics.
You?
Yes. And so we have to be able to judge the measure that we're using. But what we do know, again, that I want to bring it to males. Males also have an issue with body images and issues, and so for people carry weight differently, and so the cortisol spread seems to impact men, where all of a sudden you begin to see the waistline bulging out, and so that's also one of those indices of a potential risk for coronary heart disease, because again, it is how the body's trying to work with the stresses of life, and so we too have to be concerned about this issue of weight, but it becomes manly to be, I guess, a little thicker as well, instead of being thinner. So.
And you also have to be careful when you talk about body image, because one of the last things that you want to do, especially for young adolescent young ladies and men, is give them issues in regards to their body image. One of the things that I talk about with my patients is not that aesthetically how you look, it's what's happening on the inside. That's because good. As you mentioned, you can be healthy weight, but inside still die from a heart attack because you're not practicing healthy habits.
Don't you notice, though, it seems like curvier is in more these days than, per se, the stick-thin, model figures? I mean, it just seems like more actresses.
All about that base.
All about that. Jerry, did you have issues of body image, and do you think it was more, because you talked about dating, and so was it more acceptable to carry around that weight, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I had self-esteem issues because, how I felt and how also the food was playing a part of my mental health as well. But I did date when I was 300 pounds and dated handsome, good-looking, successful African-American men, and I mean, I didn't have like thousands of men calling me, but I wasn't the type of girl that couldn't find a date because of my weight.
Well, we caught up with some folks at a recent health and fitness expo in Washington, D.C., and got their take on overeating and snacking. Take a look.
My favorite snack food, I'm just gonna say Reese's Cups.
Potato chips I like a lot.
Pita chips. I love fried food, but I'm working on changing that.
Like if you're stressed out, you look for like some comfort food, like ice cream or something like that to eat.
So I believe people can be addicted to caffeine, sugar, salt.
I think a lot of the processed foods have chemicals in them that cause you to start to crave those foods as well.
Probably not physically addicted, but emotionally addicted. Got to have a candy bar, have to have something sweet after dinner. I don't think that's a physical need. I think it's a psychological one.
And stress actually can cause you to eat more.
So you're eating to make you comfortable.
Well, we're going to start our Q&A sessions shortly, but we want the studio audience obviously to get in their comments. But first, we have some responses we received from questions we posted earlier in the week. We tweeted, "Where's the line between thick and fat?" At Black Honey tweeted, "Thickness is in the eye of the beholder." We also asked, "Is there such a thing as sugar and food addiction?" Adalia Jones responded, "Yes, I had a friend who couldn't go without sugar every day, and when she tried, she suffered migraines. She formed a dependency on sugar." And at Janice Armstrong tweeted, "Yes, there's such a thing as sugar addiction. I want something sweet with my meals every day." Well, me too. So anyway, we want to jump in here and have you folks give us a comment or a question, and I see you back here. Hi, what's your name and your affiliation?
My name is Rachel Bennett, and I'm a chef, so
cooking
healthy is very important. I'm from the South, from Mississippi.
Okay.
And so I was always learned to eat for flavor and not for purpose. And just started thinking about poverty. You know, a lot of people on that are low income, they receive WIC. And I noticed that they, in Similac, the different milk they give you for free, what WIC has like 40% sugar in it. So if an infant is getting that much sugar at an early age, how does that respond to everything you guys just said?
Dr. Hancock?
Sure, it's sort of,
Thank
it
you.
sets a child up, one, for having that as a taste preference, number one. Number two, it changes them neurohormonally in terms of how they metabolize sugar. So it sets them up for risk later on as they get older in regards to things like diabetes. I take personal issue with it. I don't believe that formulas of any brand should be in a hospital. The focus should be on breastfeeding support. And there are certainly small percentages of mothers who can't physically breastfeed. For that reason, they should be provided with that option. But I think it's a conflict of interest for hospitals to have formula in the hospital. They're present for families to use.
Okay. Anybody else with a question? Hi, what's your name?
I'm Linda Thompson. I'm on the faculty here at Howard in the Nutritional Sciences Department, and I have a couple of quick comments. One, in terms of epigenetics, even though we may be predisposed or not predisposed to obesity, we can still have that happen in terms of our environment. Like, I'm thin, there's no overweight people in my family, but if I constantly overate, not overnight, but over years, I would become overweight and eventually obese. But the same thing, if you are predisposed to diabetes, obesity in your family, if you eat healthy, if you exercise and do and have a healthy lifestyle, you are less likely to have those diseases. The other point is, I was in a 7-Eleven that just recently opened in my neighborhood. And when I was going in, I smelled all this fried chicken. I'm like, there's no fried chicken place around here. But I realized that they're pumping out these scents. So that when I got in there, even though they didn't have fried chicken, I would be hungry and want to eat more. So I think the more we're aware of how the industry is trying to manipulate us, that can be a trigger to help us think, well, wait a minute. Now, I'm not going to allow myself to be controlled.
Right. Great comment. Dr. Greer, you were saying that marketers are targeting minority communities, correct?
And it's interesting about the atmospherics that you mentioned, because that's really the cutting edge right now of what's going on in terms of marketing, is thinking about how can you put other cues in the environment, because marketing is all about putting cues in the environment that help to reinforce the associations that it creates. So if you put cues that make you think of certain types of foods, then you'll keep on having those foods. So even if they don't have those foods, actually putting the smells in the air is another way to reinforce the attachment to them.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that are happening here in DC, in the DC schools. Lunch programs, has that changed? Let's talk about Michelle Obama, her Let's Move campaign. Is that helpful?
I think from a public health standpoint, the fact that the First Lady has made this a health issue really has energized, particularly from what I've seen being at the NIH, the emphasis on trying to get information out there. So a lot of the work that has been done with the NIH has been around things like Weight of the Nation. Those types of videos are movies that have really allowed the general public to really understand what the obesity epidemic looks like.
Okay, let's talk about school lunches here in DC.
Sure. In 2010, the DC Council passed the DC Healthy Schools Act, and there are two components to it. One is nutrition, the other is physical activity. And it really raised the bar in terms of what schools should do throughout the country in regards to school nutrition and physical activity. On average, children were getting about 30 minutes of physical activity a week in kindergarten. Not a day, but a week. And they rose those standards to require schools now to provide 150 minutes. I still think that that's not adequate, but it's much better than 30 minutes in a week. They've done a remarkable job in terms of providing school breakfast for all students every single day. And for children where 40% or more of the student population qualifies for free or reduced lunch, they actually do the breakfast in the classroom. So it brings the healthy food right where the children are. And I've definitely seen a change in clinical practice, because prior to the Healthy Schools Act, when I asked children about whether or not they ate breakfast or lunch. I would hear a lot of times, especially for breakfast, that it would be skipped, most times because of time and sometimes because of income. So being able to provide children with these healthy choices on a regular basis is phenomenal. Children spend a majority of their time in school, and it would make sense that, one, you provide them with those healthy options, but that you also teach them to make the healthier choice.
Absolutely. Hey, baby steps, you know,
Baby
step in the
steps.
right direction. Okay, anybody here trying to lose weight or have any great weight loss stories that you want to share? You do. Okay, I'm going to come on over to you. What's your name?
Jocelyn Anderson.
Okay, tell us your story.
In 2006, I was about 272 pounds, and I've lost about 110 pounds.
Congratulations,
Thank
look
you.
great.
I also had the lap band surgery, but I also realized that I had an addiction to flour and sugar products, and when I had to let those products go out of my diet, the weight came off along with exercise. But I have a question.
Okay.
I have a 19-year-old daughter who's away at college. She's seen my weight loss. There's healthy food available at the school, but she constantly chooses lots of wrong decisions as far as her meals. How do I get her to change her dietary habits so that she doesn't become a statistic?
Right. And is she overweight now?
She's not, but
she's heading that direction.
She could be.
All right, who's going to take that? Thank you.
You know, there is a psychological component to the eating. Again, the high stress level increases your desire for certain comfort foods. And again, sugar and carbohydrates become that particular food of choice. So, and being away from home is a very stressful moment. I can recall being away from home, and I did a whole lot of things that I should not have done that I won't tell you all about. But it is about understanding the psychology of good health and making healthy choices. And so people can have even healthy options presented to them and don't take those options because they're not in the habit of taking those options. There's also the idea of marketing. People will market to your pathology or market to your need. And so when they're foods that are marketed for college students, there's a taco company that actually has, for this season, they bought tickets for college students to go to bowl games, which means then that they were creating the process of marketing their particular food product, right? Taco Bell, is that what it's called?
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar.
Dr. Hancock, why don't you jump in here? I mean,
Sure. It's important for her to find her own motivation. Your experience is yours, and that's how she's going to attribute it. She has to find what's going to motivate her. It could be that there's an outfit that she wants to buy that she's had her eye on and she can't fit into it. It could simply be as simple as that. When I was in college, I was away from home, and it was stressful. But again, knowing what my family history was for me, that was what motivated me. To see that my grandmother hit over 300 pounds, to see my mother struggling with weight, hypertension, high cholesterol, and all of those things, that's all I needed to sort of scare me straight. But for other young ladies at 19, that may not necessarily be what motivates her. So continue to support her. Don't criticize her. Just be that support for her and allow her to identify when she needs to make that change and how she will do it. And when she's ready, be there to share with her the success that you've achieved.
And one thing to think about, I thought when you're away at college, you're not getting enough sleep. You know, you're limiting how many hours you're sleeping or whatnot. And we know that sleep and obesity go hand in hand. And so making sure that she gets as much sleep as possible, if that is 7 or 8 hours, if that's possible for her, that may limit her craving for unhealthy foods.
Anybody else? Hi.
My name is Chinwe, and I just have a question. I watched or read something about a mobile grocery stores that actually go into food deserts, and I was wondering, have you guys heard about that? Are there other initiatives that are like that? So,
great question. Anybody know about that? Oh, okay.
In Baltimore, they actually have mobile food stores that will bring delivery into the environment. The Baltimore City Council is working with multiple ways to try to address food deserts because there's a big food desert issue there. There's also an African-American owned grocery store that is looking at placing grocery stores in different food deserts, and they're now trying to raise money. So there's lots of initiatives going on to try to both increase the number of supermarkets and access to healthy foods and to get rid of some of the less nutritional choices. Because what those choices do is really normalize the unhealthy choices. The more you see them, they reinforce that this is what everyone eats and this is what's appropriate for us to eat.
Right. Dr. Hancock, you are a consultant and you work with families. I mean, if a family sees a healthy supermarket, they may be afraid, if they're especially on a fixed income, that they cannot afford those foods. So when you sit down, maybe give some suggestions as to what can a family do to eat healthier and not be concerned that they can't afford to eat healthier.
Right. You raise a good point. You don't necessarily have to have a higher level grocery store in order to make those choices, and you certainly don't have to break the bank. I usually suggest to families to find a way in which to incorporate some of those healthy choices in an easy fashion. So if your child usually has a sandwich in those plastic containers with the crackers and cheese, there's a way to do that on your own. So go out and buy a box of your whole grain crackers. Get a 2% cheese as opposed to the one that they include in the box. Those are those small steps. Use spinach instead of iceberg lettuce, because iceberg lettuce is the weakling among nutritional giants in the green vegetable department. So it's all of those small steps. You don't have to go out and prepare eggplant in order to make a healthier choice. It's not that families don't know how to make a healthier choice. You have to make the healthier choice the easier option, because everything is a matter of cost. It's either a matter of cost of time or cost of money. And if I'm going to expect you to spend a little bit more time in doing what it is to be healthier, I also explain to them how to save costs. Looking at the grocery ads, being strategic when you go into the grocery store. Don't go in hungry. Go in with a list. Have your children assist so that it's a dual learning activity. All of those are small steps towards making that change.
And okay, eating is part of it, but then finding the time to work out. I mean, maybe you can do some activities with your children, but when people are stressed and working 2 or 3 jobs, who has the time?
It's funny that you mentioned that. Just recently, my husband and I chased our 2-year-old around our kitchen island for 30 minutes. Now, granted, I have the time. My husband will disagree. And we certainly have the finances, having a dual income. But even with that, sometimes, even as a health and wellness consultant and a pediatric obesity expert, I still struggle sometimes to find the time for physical activity. But we'll find time for Real Housewives of fill in the blank. We'll find time for Scandal. If that's what you're going to do, be physically active while you watch. I don't care if you grab a 2-liter of beverage and do some bicep curls while you watch your favorite show. There are all kinds of creative ways that I go through with my clients and talking to them about how they can incorporate physical activity, even if it's as simple as chasing your 2-year-old around an island while you listen to music.
Are there any schools that are not just maybe telling the message to the kids, but bringing in the parents too and having that discussion as a family? I mean, are schools doing it? We talked about churches, but what about
Definitely.
schools?
I think DC again sets the bar high in terms of school engagement. There are several programs throughout the district, and particularly in east of the river, where we're trying to incorporate more physical activity in the school setting. With Children's Eye, created a STEP program where we taught traditional African American STEP in middle schools to get children really excited about being physically active, and not in that traditional PE sense, but in something that would really engage them and get them excited about being physically active. And a lot of them didn't realize how much exercise they got from doing those basic activities. So there are several examples where physical activity programs are present. They're bringing in families, bringing foods into the school setting for families to come and shop.
Okay, Dr. Powell-Whiteley.
So I think that it's not just about the children and focusing on the children per se. It's also about bringing in the parents, and I think that's where going to where people are, going to their communities, going to their churches, going to the health centers in the city, really trying to teach them about physical activity and the need for improving their diet where they are is important. But also I think it's important to let people know how much physical activity they're actually doing. And I think that's where the newer technologies are coming in to say that this is what you can do to reach 10,000 steps, or this is what you can do to get 30 minutes of vigorous activity. And you can just look at your wrist and say, oh wow, I actually reached my goal, or I need to get a little bit more work in.
Okay. Not to be a downer, but there's going to be a bigger mountain to climb, especially those on food stamps, because Congress, cutting some of those food stamp programs. So what to do then?
It is a challenge. Congress cut $8.7 billion in the recent the Farm Bill. Families are averaging $4 a day to feed their families. I don't know that I use only $4 a day to feed myself. So certainly those restraints exist, and we have to be creative in what we do. In the local grocery store where I work, prices go up on the first of the month for the items that families usually buy. So their dollar does not stretch as far as it should. It's a combination of teaching families how to be strategic and paying attention to that marketing and what the grocery stores are doing at the first of the month so that they make smarter choices, and really being able to make use of programs such as WHUT, the programs in the school setting, to bring more of that food into the home.
Okay, all good advice. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thanks to our guests and panelists, Sonia Greer, Tiffany Powell-Wiley, Kevin Washington, Yolanda Hancock, and N. Jerry Mitchell. And thanks to our studio audience for your participation, and to those of you at home watching. I'm Anqoinette Crosby. Until next time, I'll save you a seat.